Hi, my name is Henry Stoever. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. Welcome to this episode of NACD BoardVision, our online platform designed specifically to help directors and boards serve as strategic assets for the enterprise. Today, I'm joined by Mary Ann Cloyd, PwC's leader for the Center for Board Governance. Thanks for joining us today, Mary Ann.
Oh, Henry, it's great to be here. Thank you.
On this episode of NACD BoardVision, Mary Ann and I are going to discuss performance metrics, specifically within the context of creating long-term sustainable value. Mary Ann, is this a new topic, you think, or is this a time where the topic is really starting to become understood?
I think, Henry, I don't think the metric is a new topic, but I think how we define that metric and what directors should be looking at is a subject of much discussion today.
Mary Ann, you and I were recently in Chicago for NACD's Directorship 2020 event, where we convened over 100 corporate directors and governance experts. We talked about a lot of different topics during the afternoon. One specifically was this, about performance metrics that can help create long-term value for the organization. What were some of your key takeaways from the afternoon?
You know, Henry, that's a great question because I find this is always such a interesting and in many respects difficult question. Because you start out by asking a group of directors, a group of governance professionals, do you think total shareholder return should be the only metric or the main metric that you look at in assessing this? And the first answer is no. Right. But then you get into the discussion, well, then what should it be? Right. And I think one of the challenges that I heard as we listen to this discussion again is there's not some silver bullet that then defines what should that metric be. That said, I do think that what I heard was general agreement, though, that if all you're looking at is total shareholder return, you're not measuring enough. Because, and then you really get into the discussion of don't we need to be looking at qualitative information as well as quantitative information? Do we need to be concerned, or how do we define metrics that take into balance the long-term value that's being delivered, not just to shareholders, but all stakeholders? And how do we balance that against the short term?
How do you work collaboratively, or how does the board work collaboratively with the management team to develop the right metrics that both sides of the party, both sides of the organization need to be measuring on an ongoing basis?
I think that I would say it has to start with communication, as virtually everything does. That communication then goes to an agreement that we should be looking at some qualitative measurements as well as just the absolute old standard hard quantitative ones. It's then finding a way, and I think it can be different. I think it will be different for every company, for different industries, but how do you, what as a board and as a management team can you come up with that will quantitatively measure some of these qualitative concepts? And I have to, I can't let this episode in, Henry, without sharing as I listened to the discussion in that room. One of the topics that the directors were covering was one of the things that needs to be measured is innovation. So in almost any company, and again, while that will be defined differently in different industries, all companies, though, still do need to be looking at innovation. And somebody came up with the concept of existential innovation. And I love that, but I will confess that I don't know how you measure that.
Mary Ann, given that it's widely agreed that the board's primary responsibilities are to hire the right CEO, approve winning strategies, and really monitor the performance of the company, I think what we're getting here is that third part is monitoring the performance of the company. How does a board in an oversight capacity, remember these are people that are part-time leaders with full-time responsibility, how do they collaboratively develop, as opposed to being prescriptive, I want to see this number or this measure, how does the board collaboratively develop with the management team the right metrics to be following and monitoring on an ongoing basis?
And Henry, I think in many respects you've just summed it up beautifully. And I go back to, as you and I were talking just a few minutes ago, one, it starts with communication. Two, in determining metrics, it's not something that the board just goes off and does on their own. I mean, the board really, it's really done in dialogue with management, and I would probably even propose that it's management's job to suggest to the board what metrics are the right ones, or what metrics are the best ones. And it's really that discussion between the management and the board where that you then come up with agreement of this is what we're looking at. That if I'm on a board, I would really rather see an okay strategy that is executed flawlessly rather than have the absolute most dynamite strategy in the world where execution fails.
True.
And I think part of the way that you then capture whether or not that's happening is by having these, agreed upon and defined metrics to evaluate and monitor.
Thanks again, Mary Ann, for joining me on this episode of NACD BoardVision.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Henry.
On behalf of NACD, PwC, Mary Ann, and myself, thanks again for joining us on this episode of NACD BoardVision.